Two black boys start school on the same morning, same uniform, same estate, and you couldn't tell them apart. By the time they're 16, one of them is twice as likely to end up at university as the other. One's African, one's Caribbean. So what the hell happens in those 11 years? In that same Caribbean community, the girls are climbing and the boys are sinking. Caribbean girls in Britain are doing all right. Not perfect, but all right. Whereas Caribbean boys are sitting at the bottom of almost every table that actually matters. And at the same time, African kids, boys included, have quietly gone past not just the Caribbean kids, but the white British average as well. So before I continue, please buy me a coffee. I know it's hot, I'm sweating, you can probably hear the fan in the background, but it allows me to keep investing in this YouTube channel and allows me to do more research. And I want to caveat this video because I know the comments, Africa is a large continent, what about the Nigerians or the Ghanaians? And the Caribbeans are going to say to me, hey, what about the people from St. Lucia or Grenada? Unfortunately, in the UK, the data is not passed in that way. So you are just going to have to suck it up because it is what it is. So here's the trap that I need you to avoid. Half of you are going to go, oh, it's racism. And the other half are going to go, it's the broken homes, the absent dads. And I want you to ask one question before you pick a team or you pick a side, because why would either of those only hit the boys? Because if it's racism in the classroom, it's hitting Caribbean girls just as hard, right? Same skin, same teachers. And if it's broken homes and like no fathers, well, the girls grow up in the same homes as the boys because they're usually brothers and sisters. So something's missing, right? Because it's the same mum, the same missing dad, the same postcode, same everything. So it can't be that simple. And sometimes I think, I get into that habit of blaming, fatherless homes and that. But that can't just be the sole thing to blame. So there has to be more to it than that. Because there is something going on in Black Britain right now that is affecting Black British-born Caribbean kids at a higher rate than everybody else. And I've really thought about how to really drill this down because we do see a diversion when it comes to Black British Africans and Black British Caribbeans. And listen, I'm Caribbean, Jamaican to be exact. So this one isn't nice for me. It probably won't be nice for you. Some of my own people are not going to like me for what I'm about to say, especially when I start talking about marriage, single mums, and who we date. But I'd rather we look at it properly than keep pretending we don't know. So let's get into it. GCSE. In 2022 and 2023, almost 70% of African kids got at least a grade 4 or above, whereas Black Caribbean kids sat at around 50%. The national average sits at around 65%. So what that tells us is African kids don't just beat Caribbean kids, they beat the national average. They went past everybody. And there's a measure of the progress kids make between primary and GCSE. The government call it Progress 8. It's essentially like a measurement of how children progress between primary school and secondary school. And to simplify how it's measured, basically African kids score at around plus 0.37, gaining ground, while Caribbean kids score minus 0.24. So technically, Caribbean kids are losing ground as they move through the system. And the Education Policy and Institute found African kids actually overtook the white British average somewhere between 2019 and 2023, while Caribbean kids stayed at the bottom and then even fell further behind during COVID. So the gap, unfortunately, isn't closing. It's actually getting wider. And I'll get into the why of the situation as I go through this video. To make matters worse, this carries on as we move into university. Think of it. 2/3 of Black African young people actually go to university, whereas in the Caribbean community, it's about under half. And at the top universities, the Russell Group ones, it's African 12% versus Caribbean at 5%. Caribbean kids are second from bottom of every single ethnic group for getting into a top university. Only gypsies and traveller kids are lower, according to official data, which is, and I'm not being dramatic when I say this, that is absolutely diabolical. But there's a harder question here, and it's actually why. Like, why is that the case? And the first clue is kind of hiding in the introduction that I made. At GCSE level, 57% of Caribbean girls pass maths and English, right? Whereas Caribbean boys is about 46%. And that's the biggest gender gap of any ethnic group in the whole country. And it shows up pretty early, age 11. And in primary school, about 64% of Caribbean girls are hitting the standard grades, whereas only 49% of the boys are. And it runs all the way up. Caribbean girls, they go to uni at about 55%, whereas Caribbean boys are at 34%. So we're seeing a large discrepancy there. And here's why I think this is important and ultimately why it matters so much. If the cause was just racism in schools, it would be dragging the girls down with the boys. And I'm not saying that racism doesn't exist, but it would be more visible in its nature. And if the cause was just absent dads and broken homes, which is a certain thing that people love to bang on about, then that would also hit the girls as well, right? Naturally, you'd think that, but it doesn't. The girls are actually climbing and they're improving, but the boys specifically are sinking. So whatever's going on, it lands on the black boys harder than the black girls. And as I was scripting this video and doing some light research, I thought more and more about it. This journey doesn't start with where we are now, but instead back on those boats. It starts with Windrush. 1948, the empire of the Windrush docks is essentially the symbolic start of mass Caribbean migration. And here's what people tend to forget. We were invited here. Britain had holes after the war. They needed people to drive the buses, to build the houses, to run the new NHS, do the post. So the Caribbean people came to do the jobs nobody wanted. Nurses, cleaners, drivers, laborers, grafters. Listen, and we got treated like dirt for doing it. No blacks, no dogs, no Irish. You know the saying. And look, families were placed in the worst housing, the worst streets, paid below what we were worth, even when we were qualified. That is the foundation of the Caribbean community that got built in this country. We were recruited for our labor and then locked out of everything above it. That's just the reality that we have to think about. Now, compare that to the African wave, which came a little bit later, mostly the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And this is where a big chunk of the gap comes from. This is not to say that there weren't Africans in the UK before then, but not at this volume. And that's where people get it twisted, because I get people that comment on my video saying Africans have been there. Yes, you've been there. But come on, not at the same rate. African migration to Britain was selective. It wasn't, oh, come drive our buses. A lot of it was actually students, professionals, people coming for education. When Nigeria's economy struggled, when Ghana's economy struggled, it was often the doctors, the lawyers, the teachers, the strivers who got out and came here. The academics have a name for it. They call it immigrant optimism. The idea that people who cross the world for a better life arrive buzzing with ambition and then they pour every drop of it into their kids. And look, this is going to be a football thing for me because everything's a football thing with me. Imagine two football clubs. The Windrush Club gets built by signing the grafters, the honest squad players, the Jordan Henderson types. They run all day. They do the dirty work nobody else will do. They're the backbone of the team, right? But they were ultimately signed to do the labor, not to be the stars. The African Wave Club only signs proven talent. It cherry picks. It goes, I'm only taking the lad who already scored 30 goals last season, the one who's already got the degree, the one who's already a doctor. Think of it like that. Of course, the club's academy is going to produce bangers. You always do. But you stack the deck before the kids were even born. I hope that made sense because it made sense in my head. Now, look, that's not perfect because obviously, not every African family is professors, doctors, and not every Caribbean family is laborers. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just talking about the averages here and the starting positions. And the reality is that the starting positions were slightly different. One community was kind of picked for ambition and the other was selected for their graft and their labor. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting. And this is the part that not a lot of people talk about because it's not just where we started, it's how they built their families once they actually got here. And the numbers are stark. And this is where, yes, culturally, we start to see a delineation. So, according to the 2011 census, African households were more likely to be married. 26% of Black African households were a married couple versus 17% of Caribbean households. And when you look at married couples actually raising kids, married with dependent children is 20% for Africans versus 9.6% for Caribbeans. So an African kid is more than twice as likely to be growing up with two married parents in the house. Flip it the other way, Caribbean households are the most likely in the entire country to be a single person living alone. And on the latest census, over half of Caribbean families with kids, 51%, are headed by a lone parent. Highest of any ethnic group in Britain, full stop. I'm not going to sit here and pretend. A kid having two committed parents in the house, pooling two incomes, splitting the school runs and the homework and the discipline is the same as one tired parent doing it all alone. It's not the same. Single mums are out here doing it alone and they're carrying the whole world on their back. And I'm not blaming them. In fact, I'm in awe of a lot of them. But we have to be honest. We have to be honest about the maths here. But I don't want to repeat what I've said in like so many other videos. So I have to hold the men accountable as I always do. The reality is that Black Caribbean men in the UK aren't doing a great job. And we're not performing. Like we're not performing at the level that we should be. But I also have to recognize that there are some systemic things that affect men differently to women. One thing is that there are barely any Black men in teaching positions. Black men do not go into the education force at a primary level, which means we get young black boys who never see anyone who even looks remotely like them. The thing is, education is not just books. We think it is, but it's not. It's also non-verbal. It's visual. And if you don't ever see a person who, looks like you in a position of power, what type of thoughts go through your head? Like, what do you think about yourself? Because there are questions that not enough people ask. You might ask yourself, hey, are people like me supposed to be in positions of authority? It's something that people don't ask. They don't question that. And I think that is something that we have to look at. And I'm not saying it's the only reason, but I am just pointing it out. Another factor is that Caribbean people assimilated to British culture a lot quicker. And I don't know what it is, but I think the mix of Caribbean culture and British culture has resulted in a generation of Black Caribbean men who are just not pulling their weight. I don't know what it is, but I think there's like a toxic mix in there. And we can talk about systemic racism. We can talk about the white man holding us down, and all of that might be true. I will never say it's not true. But what I will ask of ourselves in this is, what the hell are we going to do about it? We are men. We are not victims. If we are unfortunately building a society of fatherless boys who unfortunately are going and failing in school, the vicious cycle, it continues and it just goes round and round and round. So as I've said in the past, there are some structural matters in place that hold Black men down. But at the same time, I do wholeheartedly believe that we can actually do something about it. It's our duty to do something about it. There's a popular researcher called Tracy Reynolds, right? She wrote a whole book called Caribbean Mothers. I didn't get to read the whole book, but I read some excerpts, and her point is that the census doesn't actually understand how Caribbean families work. And I was so happy to read this because a lot of our families run on what she calls visiting relationships, common law setups, big extended networks, grandmothers, aunties, the whole village raising the child, and fathers who don't live in the house but are absolutely still in the kid's life. For example, like my dad. My mum and him were not together, but I saw my dad pretty much every other week at least. I grew up with my dad in my life. Was he married to my mother at the time? No, but he was around. He wasn't absent. He wasn't an absent father. So the census doesn't obviously moderate for that. The reality on the ground is a bit more complicated, and it's probably more supported than the tick box census can actually make it look. So before we cry that all Black families are broken, some of that brokenness is just a clipboard not knowing what it's looking at. And I do think that it's important that we understand that when we look at research or surveys, we kind of have to find the balance of looking at the data and numbers and also what we see in front of us, like what's actually in front of our eyes in real life. And there's a deeper history. There's more of a complex story under all of this. So there's another thing. Caribbean families were shaped by slavery, by a system that basically ripped families apart on purpose for hundreds of years and left the mother and child as the one unit nobody could sell away from each other. Whereas a lot of the West African families that came here in the 90s arrived more intact because they were never put through the same machine. I'm not saying that colonialism didn't affect Africa. Of course it did, but it's not in the same way. The full story of what slavery did to the Black family is genuinely another video, and it's a whole heavy one. But I need you to hear me out for a second. If broken homes were the engine, it would be wrecking the girls too, right? They grow up with the same missing dad, but the girls are doing okay. There's even some research that they did in South America where they basically went looking for this same thing. They were hoping to find that boys without dads do worse than girls without dads, and they didn't find it. The boys weren't hit harder by the absent fathers, right? So no dad in the house cannot be the main thing. It cannot be the main reason dragging the boys down over here specifically, because it would drag the daughters down too, and it doesn't. So something else is grabbing the boys, and to find it, I've got to tell you about a man called Bernard Coard. He's from Grenada and he wrote a little book. It was only 50 pages and it was called How the West Indian Child is Made Educationally Subnormal in the British School System. Educationally subnormal. That was an actual official category. And what Coard proved was that British schools were taking Caribbean kids and disproportionately the boys and sticking them in front of a biased IQ test they were never going to pass and shipping them off to subnormal schools that, in his words, prepared them for survival, not for excelling. By 1970, ethnic minorities were 70% of kids in normal London schools, but 34% of the kids in these subnormal ones, double. Now, I wasn't alive in that time, but that is fucking nuts. Basically, that's a country looking at a generation of Black boys and deciding on purpose with paperwork that they were stupid. And if you think that's ancient history, Steve McQueen made a whole film about it. the education episode of Small Axe, which is the name of the show, there was also a BBC documentary called Subnormal, a British Scandal. This happened. This is real life. This was documented. I'm not making this up. And that's why I like making these videos, because as part of my preparation process, I have to go out there and learn these new things that I put together. I didn't even know this existed. But anyway, here is why all of this is important, right? Because that scandal didn't just hurt the boys. It poisoned the trust between black families and the school system. And it took the immigrant optimism the Caribbean mayor came with, because trust me, we came with optimism too. Our grandparents were strivers, but it ground it down over time, right? Over 4 generations of being told, you're not good enough. You can see the modern version of it in the discipline numbers today, which are kind of the smoking gun. Caribbean boys are 3 times more likely to be permanently excluded from school than the average kid. 3 times they get put in bottom sets for their behavior, not their ability. The research says they get routinely punished more harshly, praised less, and told off more often. And once a kid gets excluded, only about 15% ever make it back into normal school. The rest of them, a lot of them, end up in the justice system. They literally call it the school to prison pipeline. I remember when I moved school, they actually tried to put me in the bottom set for physics when I moved school. I literally had to sit there and argue with my head of year, because the school year just started. I was like 13 or maybe 14, and I was in the physics class, and I was just sitting there thinking, I know some of these boys in this class, and respectfully, I should not be in class with them. And they were giving me like foundation level work. And back then, if you took a foundation course, it meant you couldn't get above a C at GCSE level. I literally had to complain for weeks. Mind you, I never got anything worse than a A or a B in secondary school. Like, not that GCSEs even matter that much, but my point in that, like, even when you're quote unquote good, they can still find a way to try and put you down. But let's get back to the exclusion later. African boys don't actually get excluded at the same rates as Black Caribbean boys, even though we go through the same school system, same teachers. So we have to kind of think about why that happens, right? Because some people argue that the system kind of writes off Caribbean boys, and that's something that lands on boys way harder than the girls. But I think that there's more we can look at here. And there's a researcher called Steve Strand, and he looked at all the data, and he found that even Caribbean boys from well-off, higher-earning, middle-class families with good money, nice houses, they still scored lower than comparable white British boys from the same kind of homes. It's not just poverty. Money doesn't buy your son out of these issues. And Strand basically pointed the finger at teacher expectations. Caribbean boys getting entered for the lower capped exam papers, even when their results say they should be on the higher ones. A teacher deciding how far the boy goes before he even sat down. But I still don't think it explains why Black African boys get excluded less than Black Caribbean boys. So one thing I didn't quite dive into is the family dynamics. And you and me both know this is important. Black Caribbean men in the UK are often labeled as womanizers. We get that label a lot, often having multiple kids with multiple women, and also most likely to date outside of our race. Technically, that is, well, it's true. It's a fact if you go by marriage rates. Whether we like it or not as Black men or Black Caribbean men, those are numbers, and it's visible with our eyes. But I want you to think about it. You've got a community that married within itself, stayed tight, and built its whole social life around the church. Black African men are more likely to marry within their own race compared to Black British Caribbean men. I recently made a post about Black Jamaicans, and half the comments were talking about how much Black Jamaican men love overweight white women. It's a bit of a running joke in the community. So we cannot deny there are some cultural differences, and I will diverge from the numbers for a second because the numbers don't tell everything. But Nigerians, Ghanaians, Jamaicans, we're all very religious people. Many of us grew up going to church. I think that set the tone for many of us growing up, right? But I also think the expectations in West African culture is different. I remember going to a Nigerian friend's house, yeah? I never greeted the mother as auntie. I never did it. I said hello, and I soon realized that is not something you do when you greet a Nigerian elder. Now me, in my typical British mindset, was like, why the hell would I greet this person? They're not above me, and I don't owe them anything. And to be honest, as I sit here, maybe ignorantly, I still feel the same way. I wouldn't call someone my auntie who's not my auntie. The difference is that many West African boys do believe in that hierarchical system. They do have immense respect for their elders, whether it be to their personal detriment or not. In some ways, I think it's beautiful. I think it's good. But also in some ways, I do think it can strip away West African kids of their freedom of expression and, you know, a little bit of their own personality. That's another video of my own take of of them. Now, but this family unit and structure trickles down into the kids. And then also in how the dads speak to their boys. If you speak to a Nigerian or Ghanaian boy, 9 times out of 10, they've been told by their dad they'll become a doctor, a lawyer, a banker. And that's what's installed in them from a very, very young age. Education is immensely important in their households. And that is not to say that it isn't or wasn't in mine as a Jamaican family, but definitely not to the degree of some of my West African friends that I grew up with. And this is all anecdotal. I don't have paperwork to back what I'm saying, but I know hundreds of you can relate. The funny thing is, when you go back to a place like Jamaica, education is bloody important and it's strict. So why do we lose that when we arrive here? Like I said earlier, I think something happens when you mix that Caribbean culture with the British culture. Something toxic takes place. I don't know what it is, but it's not boding well for the boys. There is research that found that over 90% of Black, African and other minority parents want their children to stay in school past 16 versus 77% of white British parents. And another study found the drive to get to university was strongest of all for Black African kids. That's not a household structure. That's a culture of like expectation carried in a tight community and reinforced every single week. That's the real engine, let's be honest. Another thing is that Caribbean people have among the highest interracial partnership rates in Britain. 43% of Caribbean people in couples are in a mixed relationship, double the African rate, and 65% for the under 25s. The mixed white and Black Caribbean group is one of the biggest mixed groups in the country, according to the research, and double the mixed white and Black African group, even though our community is less than half the size. Some people argue that integration diluted our community resources. Others say integration brings access and opportunity. Listen, I'm not Dr. Umar Johnson, but we cannot sit here and act like Caribbean men do seem to date outside their race a lot more than others. And I can only imagine a few reasons as to why. But double the rate of Africans is somewhat surprising to me. And I would say a little bit worrying. Look. Love who you love. I ain't going to tell you to, it's not my job to tell you to love, right? I don't care. But there's a reason why Black women blast Black men who date outside their race, especially those who have resources. We are pouring those resources into other communities that already have a head start. Another barrier to building intergenerational wealth, but let's stay on topic because that's another video. I'll get onto that another time. But anyway, there is a serious argument that integration is actually a good thing and that marrying out and mixing brings access, brings networks, brings opportunities. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. But here is something I can't ignore. Those mixed white and Caribbean kids, the data says they're actually one of the lowest performing mixed groups in the whole country. And they get excluded at the same brutal rates as Black Caribbean kids. And to me, listen, that's not an argument against love or against anybody's family. It's the opposite. It tells me the problem was never about who we marry or how Black or how mixed the kid is. It's more about how this country's school treats a boy the second they read him as a Black boy. The school grabs him either way. And that points the finger straight back at the system, not the family. So let me try and bring this all together because I've kind of gone in a giant circle here. On one side, you got the African community. You know, they came here a little bit later. They marry within their own culture a lot more than Black Caribbeans do. They're tight, they're religious, and they do transmit their expectations like a machine. It's still running on first or second generation optimism. On the other hand, you've got the Caribbean community kind of recruited initially for like graft and labor, probably 3 or 4 generations deep for a lot of us. Some maybe second generation. We're a bit more spread out. We're a bit more integrated into the white British culture, have a rather large single parent issue on paper. And most importantly, with its boys getting picked off by a school system that's been writing them off since 1970s, if you remember the sub-education bit, it's not one thing, it's all of it stacked together. And this is where things get a bit more interesting. Once both groups actually get into university, the African advantage kind of vanishes a little bit. There's a thing called the degree awarding gap. Basically, who walks out with a good degree? A first or a 2-1. And the gap between Black and white students is pretty big. It's actually wider for Black African students, 23 percentage points, than for Black Caribbean boys, which is at 19 percentage points. African boys basically show up to uni ahead on paper. And something in the system basically shortens the gap. Now, I never went to uni in the UK. I did go to uni, but it was in the States. So this one is one experience that I can't really talk on with real life experience, but I can think of some reasons why. And listen, it doesn't stop at uni. In the world of work, Black employees, African and Caribbean both, are the only ethnic group that consistently earn less than white employees year after year. Compare like for like, same job, same qualifications, same age, and black workers go from earning a bit more to earning about 6% less, like for like. And those CV experiments where they send out identical applications with different names, the black sounding names have to send out roughly 60% more applications to get the same callbacks. So let me say the thing that actually matters. This was never really about Africans versus Caribbeans. That framing of it actually is frustrating, and it keeps us scrapping with each other while the ceiling sits there laughing at both of us. African families tend to have the male at the head of the table. They are more patriarchal in nature, whereas in Caribbean families, the men can somewhat be a bit passive. So this leads me to wonder how second, third, and fourth generation African boys will perform over the next 20 and 30 years, because as Caribbeans assimilated more to the British culture, we can see our performance continuing to decline. I wonder how the West African culture will fare over the next few decades. The truth is, African people, and really in this context, I'm speaking on West Africa, have strong family values that do result in better performance from a westernized viewpoint. If we are talking about secondary school, college, uni, it fits into this society and it works. And the fact that from an academic standpoint, many outperform even white kids, we can say it's not racial, or at least it's a lazy argument to say it's just racial. But there's one last thing I can't leave out, because it's proof that none of this is about ability. The Caribbean community didn't just sit there and take it. After the subnormal scandal, black parents built their own schools. I'm talking Saturday schools, supplementary schools, set up at the end of the 60s. Parents who worked all week as nurses and drivers gave up their Saturdays to teach their own kids maths, English, black history, because they could see the mainstream school was failing their boys on purpose. Akala actually wrote about it. I've got his book somewhere here. Someone moved it, but I do have his book here. Kahinde Andrews actually wrote about this as well, and it worked. The kids who went through the schools did better. So the Caribbean community had a machine and system. Many of it was built through the church. Interestingly, as society has become more secular, we see a decline in the black boy performance. So I guess I need to explore, why can't we rebuild this bigger and better now? We have the resources, we have the community, but we need more pooled resources to actually help young black Caribbean boys make up the gap. Don't get me wrong, African boys are not perfect, but we can see that our own brothers, and yes, I call them brothers, we're all black, they can perform and do well in the same system that we are in. But there are a few key differences. A bulk of it is cultural. Like I said earlier, we can't sit here and be victims. We have to look at reintroducing Saturday schools, more book clubs, more community resources to help black boys that are failing in the traditional school system, specifically for black Caribbean boys. This is the only way we're going to really close the gap in the immediate future. Long term, it's simple. Men around my age need to be laying down the habits of success for the next generation. What I mean by that is we need to ensure that we aren't just popping up with kids left, right, and center. We need to ensure that we're investing in ourselves financially and putting ourselves in a good position. We need to ensure when we do have children, we're doing our very best to educate them on how to excel in this current system. Whether you like it or not, that's besides the point. So let me bring it home. 2 black boys start school in the same week in this country. The data says, on average, very different things are going to happen to them. And we burn so much energy arguing about whose fault it is. Is it racism? Is it dads? Is it single mums? Is it who we marry? Is it the system? That we miss the actual answer, which is that it's all of them, stacked on top of each other over 70 years. And the next time somebody points at the African numbers and says, see, it can be done, it's not racism, look how well they're doing, send them this video and explain that it's actually way more nuanced than that. Black people are not a monolith and our experiences vary. But before I wrap it up, I mentioned how black Caribbean men date outside their race the most. And if you want to explore how that is damaging black love, you need to watch this video right here. Until then, check on the people closest to you and also check the description to buy a coffee and support this channel. Peace and blessings to you all.